recording, and I'm gonna mute Bruce and Judith so we don't get this feedback. And what we're going to do, the bulk of this thing today is on Jung, but I wanted to go back and do a little bit of science because it's hard to appreciate how fundamental the work that Ron Cowan did with observing different things, how it plays into the real underpinnings that everything we're talking about. So I'm going to go to share screen here. Hold on one sec.
Oh, we're missing Cheryl and Barbara.
Yeah, but we'll see.
Did you hear from them?
I did not hear from them, but they may or may not show up. We'll make room for them. So just to go back and review a little bit, what Ron observed was that we have a 26 real dimensional space, and we're in a piece of it, 4 dimensions, 3 for space and 1 for time. And then there's the so-called compactified dimensions that are too small to see, that are all around us. So to put it differently, at every single point around us, we need 26 numbers to describe what's going on, 24 for space and 2 for time. 2 for time is a little misleading because the 2 time dimensions are actually the same time dimension, only multiplied by the square root of -1. I have no idea why that's the case, but it appears to be the case. So we have all of these compactified dimensions, and what Ron observed was there's all kinds of information flow happening in here. There's all of the different particles and fields and everything are all controlled by the messages that are running around in all these compactified dimensions here. And in fact, that appears to be what's the real fundamental thing underlying what we call space and time. So there's something underneath space and time, which is that what we ended up calling information from one of anything better. And let me just go there to this picture. So here's a picture, different picture. We're just showing, we started off with this information that's in those compactified dimensions flying all over the place, keeping everything in sync. And then there's just a hierarchy here where you have physics, chemistry, and biology. Physics is the most fundamental with the particles and fields. Chemistry is aggregations of those, and biology deals with life from both matter and dark matter. So it's the information here that controls everything. And there's 2 types of information. There are the data, the bits that make up everything. And then there's the algorithms that control the bits or the information. So we never really talked about algorithms. So that's really what I'm going to do here. I'm going to get out of this, and we're going to go over to talk just a little bit about algorithms, because this is something that's relatively new. It really came about courtesy of computers, starting in the 1950s and 1960s, and it built up and up and so forth. So if anyone uses the term computer science, the real science piece in computer science is algorithms, in my opinion. That's what really is fundamental, is how you actually do these manipulations of these bits. And there's a story to this, so we're going to go through the story. The thing to keep in mind, we've got these different sources of information. So some of the stuff is from Wikipedia, but there's a number of nice books out there. Everybody will get this handout. So let's just cut to the chase. What is an algorithm? In mathematics and computer science, an algorithm is a finite sequence of instructions. They're all well-defined, and they're used to solve a particular problem. Like, why don't you sum up all the numbers from 1 to 10? So you'd start off, and the first step would be you'd start with 0, and then you'd add to 0 the number 1, and then that gives you 1, and then the next step would be you'd add the next number, so you add to 1 the next number, which is 2, and then you get 3, and so you have a sequence of well-defined instructions, and that gives you the sum of the numbers of 1 to 10. And so the algorithms are really the specifications for how you're carrying out these calculations, or more importantly, they're actually at a more fundamental level manipulating symbols. So let's get into this a little more. The first curveball that comes up is there's a heuristic algorithm that you run into. And so sometimes people come up with some ideas for heuristics for things that, you know, sound kind of neat, and they throw them together, and they may or may not get you the right answer, but people use them all the time. And, you know, a lot of the stuff that we do as people for processing information, you'd say, is probably heuristic. We don't go through some really well-defined steps. We go through a bunch of things that are really not necessarily correct or optimal or anything you could think like that. But that's
Define heuristic.
Well, what you're going to see an example of a heuristic algorithm coming up here a little later on. So I just want to plant the notion that it's something that's kind of a funny sort of algorithm. So just to go back to, we had an algorithm here, which we had a set of states, and we ended up with an output based on the input. That's the key thing to keep in mind. And now we come to the crux of this. Why are we even doing this? Well, it turns out that when people put algorithms together, they notice that some of them seem to run, you know, nice and fast, and some of them seem to take forever to run. They were just, you know, and they were people trying to figure out, why is this one so slow? Why is this one so fast? Why does this one take up so much memory? Why does this one not take up any memory? All of these things started coming up, and people kept staring at these things, and they started to categorize these problems as being into algorithms that ran in what they called polynomial time. So it might run, if, for example, if I had 10 data points, and it would take 1 second for me to do whatever I'm going to do with those 10 data points, and then I went to 100 data points, so I had 10 times as many, then it might run, say, 100 times as long. So it's going up as the square of the number of inputs that I have there. Okay. But if I go to 1,000, it's going to be 1,000 times. So it goes. So those are things that it would be called polynomial in time, because they go up as, say, a power polynomial of whatever the data that you're dealing with. Now there's other problems that are a little different, and they seem to take forever to run. And so we take the same example where we have, say, 10 data points, and it takes 1 second to run. And then we take 100 data points, and it takes 1 year to run. And then we take 1,000 data points, and it takes 1,000 centuries to run. And we can't simply wait around for these things. All we know is that there's something fundamentally different about these sorts of problems that takes forever to run, and they're called non-deterministic polynomial time. So people sometimes say, oh, they're growing as an exponentially fast in the input or things like that. But it just means that they're going to run much slower than the sort of things that you would run into in everyday life. And so what came up was people started asking themselves, well, if we have these polynomial time problems, which they called class P, and we have the non-deterministic polynomial time, which they called NP, then what's the difference between P and NP? What is the fundamental difference here? And this is the crux of the whole issue, is that some things are easy and some things aren't. So let's just dig into this a little bit more. This is still trying to be informal, but no one really knows that much about this. this has been worked on for 50 years. People have all kinds of ideas about this, and we're still having it as one of the unsolved problems in mathematics that, as we sit here today, has been open for 50 years.
Mark, can I interject a question, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just listening to you, it strikes me that you're treating all of these data points as equal. Perhaps these 10 data points are in this easy processing category, and one or more of the next 10 data points are in a very difficult processing category, but they're all lumped together as data points, so they're equal.
Well, yeah, Steve, that's a good point, but they would actually be considered different problems, okay? Whenever I'm talking about inputs, I'm saying that the inputs themselves are all of the same type, and we're just scaling the number of inputs, okay? So the example that you just gave is really two types of problems, one with one type of inputs and one with a mix of the two, and that's not what we're talking about. You know, I'm just trying to constrain the problem so that we can try and say something about it. That's all.
Thank you.
So people have been going nuts on this. I just there's a lot of words here, so I'm going to just skip over this stuff to cut to the chase. Let's see, where did my mouse go? Here it is. There's all kinds of variations that people have come up with. So there's NP hard, NP complete, on here, and so it goes. So here's a picture, for example, out of Wikipedia for an NP hard problem. So we have some strange axes here, and we have problems in this area here that are called NP hard. And then this is a Venn diagram. Here's another one here showing the NP hard. And the difference in these two figures, by the way, is that over on the right-hand side of this, the class P equals the class NP. Okay, they're actually the same class. No one believes that. Everyone thinks it's the other one on the left, which is that P doesn't equal NP. And so that's why we end up with different pictures. We end up with this picture for P equals NP, with the NP hard being some group of problems here, and then all the P equals NP are here in the middle, and so it goes. Whereas over here we have NP hard, NP complete, NP P, and you can see that NP and P are different. NP complete is over here, and it goes on and on. And I can't tell you how many pictures like this you can come across with people trying to figure out which end is up. But the key thing is no one knows, does P equal NP or P not equal NP? That is the whole question here. Now, there is a problem that everyone cites called the traveling salesman problem. And the traveling salesman problem is a salesman is given a list of cities, and he's trying to find the shortest, or she, the shortest possible route so that you visit each city exactly once and get back to where you started from. And it's been shown that this is an NP hard problem, okay? That if you try and come up with a solution to this, for 10 cities, it takes 1 second. For 100 cities, it takes, a week. And for 1,000 cities, it takes 27 centuries. And so it goes. So people have no idea how to come up with the exact solution to this traveling salesman problem. They have algorithms for doing it, but they're very hard to deal with. So one of the things that came up with all this, I'm just going to skip ahead here, is that someone asked, is it possible to come up with a heuristic for this? Okay, since the problem by itself is very intractable, maybe there's some crazy things we can come up with that would be, not quite the perfect algorithm for solving what I just said, but would come close to it in some sense. And so there were a couple of people at Bell Laboratories, Shen Lin and Brian Kernighan, who came up with a set of heuristics for doing this. And the reason why they were doing this was it wasn't for salesmen. They were trying to design networks for large companies. And what comes up when you try and design these networks is large company will have maybe 20 very large locations, and then maybe 1,000 very small locations. And the question is, which one of these sites that you have there is going to be on some, I'll call it backbone network, and which ones of these other things are going to be not on the backbone network, they're going to be on a little network that connects to the backbone network. And you can turn this traveling salesman problem around and come up with ways to design backbone networks for these large companies. And in fact, this is used in the internet today. Back when they were doing this, it was done for designing voice telephone networks for large companies. But here today it's being used to actually design things for, like, how does Netflix really work? How do you design a network for Netflix to run over the internet so that everybody gets good movie service, these sorts of things. And so the key thing about this is that it scales. When you go up to from 10 to 100 to 1,000, it only takes a very small additional amount of time. It goes from 1 second to 1.5 seconds to 2 seconds for going from 10 to 100 to 1,000. And so that's the first thing about it, is it's very quick. And what that means is, therefore, it's very cheap. If you come up with a solution here with this heuristic, you end up with something that you may or may not like, but it doesn't cost you anything really. So you throw it away and generate a new one. And now you look at the new one and maybe you like the new one more. And so you're off to the races. But you've never ever solved the actual full-blown traveling salesman problem here. You've just come up with something that in some sense is close to the solution. So this suggests that a lot of the agony in dealing with this P versus NP stuff is probably academic, that there's probably underlying it some algorithms that are heuristic that run everything, and they're good enough for getting the job done. And deep down, I think something like this is what's going on for making the universe run. What's underneath it all has to be robust. We have things like DNA, and when we transcribe DNA, it's not a perfect transcription process. So you have 3 billion base pairs in your DNA, and it copies it with a fidelity of, say, it'll make one error in every 100 million copies. Well, 100 million is only 10 to the 8th, and we've got 3 billion of these things. So if I take 3 times 10 to the 9th base pairs and I divide it by 10 to the 8th, I've got 30 errors here, and yet we're still alive. Okay, the doing a bad job of copying DNA. This was good enough to get the job done, to lead to life. And there's probably something like that going on here with this, with these other heuristics. But this is what underlies space and time. Algorithms like this are going to be creating what we think of as compartments of space. And the particles hop between these compartments. And it's probably due to algorithms like this. So I just want to plant that seed with you. And I'm going to get out of this now and just run a short little video so you can get someone else's perspective on this. Let's see, not this one. Here we go, here. So I'm going to go to this video.
Today, I want to talk about the deepest unanswered question in computer science, and maybe in all of math.
These are all on our website now.
And I want to talk about how ideas from computing show up in the everyday world around us, and how problems as seemingly disparate as protein folding and making up crossword puzzles share a common core difficulty that turns out to be a lot like Sudoku. Well, okay, basically it is Sudoku. In 2000, the Clay Institute offered $1 million each for the solutions to 7 key problems in math, the Millennium Prize problems. These are profound and difficult problems, and for most of them, it takes a lot of specialized knowledge to even understand the question. Of the 7 problems, P versus NP was both the most recently conceived in 1971 and by far the easiest one to understand and explain. And in March 2010, the Clay Institute awarded the first of its 7 prizes for the solution to, yeah, not P versus NP. So what is the P versus NP question? Well, back in the 70s, computer scientists were busily figuring out how to program their retro-fabulous cabinet-sized computers to solve all the world's problems. Sometimes the first program anyone could think of for a particular problem would be unworkably slow, but then over time people would come up with clever ways to make it faster. Or at least that happened for some problems. For others, nobody was coming up with faster programs. To get a handle on the situation, they started sorting the problems into classes based on how fast a program could solve them. For problems like multiplication, they had really fast programs, and for others, like playing absolutely perfect chess, they figured out that there just was no fast program. But for a bunch in between, they weren't sure whether there was a fast way to do it. So they kept trying. This is where P and NP come in. Skipping a ton of details for a second, P is a class that basically includes all the problems that can be solved by a reasonably fast program, like multiplication or alphabetizing a list of names. And then around and including P, we sort of discovered a class called NP. That's all the problems where if you're given a correct solution, you can at least check it in a reasonable amount of time. NP was totally maddening because it contained lots of important problems like vehicle routing and scheduling and problems in circuit design and databases. And often we'd get lucky and find that an NP problem was actually a part of P, and we'd have our fast program. But for a lot of them, that didn't seem to be happening. So people started to wonder whether everything in NP would turn out to be in P, or if there were some NP problems that were truly harder than the ones in P. That's the P versus NP question. If all the NP problems are really in P, a lot of important puzzles we've been struggling with are going to turn out to be easy for computers to solve. Puzzles connected to biology and curing cancer, puzzles in business and economics, we'd have a lot of miracle answers almost overnight. And also the encryption we use for things like online banking would be easy to crack because it's based on NP problems. Okay, examples. I like to think of the problems in NP as being basically like puzzles, because I think what makes a puzzle is that it's a problem where you can give away the answer. And that's what NP means. Like with Sudoku. Sudoku puzzles can take a long time to solve, but if I give you a solved Sudoku grid, checking it for mistakes is pretty quick. Outside of NP are problems where it's hard to even check an answer. Like, what's the best move to make in this chess game? I could tell you the answer, but how would you know whether I'm right? Well, you wouldn't, because finding out requires a calculation so enormous that there's a pretty good argument we'll never be able to build a computer that could do it. To me, that's not a very good puzzle. It's practically impossible to know whether you've solved it. On the other side are all the reasonable, solvable puzzles in P. These are clearly also in NP, because one way to check an answer is to go through the process of finding it yourself. Like if I were to tell you that the answer to 51 times 3 is 153, how would you check whether I'm right? You'd probably just multiply 51 by 3 yourself, because it's fast to do it. But Sudoku is different, or at least we think it is. It seems like solving a Sudoku grid is a lot harder than checking a solution, but in fact, nobody's been able to prove it yet. As far as we know, there could be a clever way of playing Sudoku much, much faster. So that's the question. Does being able to quickly recognize correct answers mean there's also a quick way to find them? Nobody knows for sure, but either way, figuring out exactly how this works would teach us something important about the nature of computation. It gets weirder from here, but first, 3 important details. 1, you might be thinking, hey, Sudoku is tough and all, but it's not that hard. What's the big deal? Well, we're really talking about how the difficulty scales up as you make the problem bigger and bigger. Like, how much harder is a 100 by 100 Sudoku grid than a standard 9 by 9 grid? We've been making computers exponentially faster as time goes on, so for problems that don't get exponentially harder as they get bigger, all we have to do is wait for computers to get more powerful, and then even huge versions of those problems will be easy to solve by computer. Like, multiplication problems are pretty easy for computers even with enormous numbers. As the numbers get bigger, multiplying them just doesn't get harder very fast. These days, the phone in your pocket is what would have been referred to in the 1970s as a supercomputer, and you'd have to make a truly huge multiplication problem to stand up to all the computational power we've got now. Lots of familiar puzzles like mazes and Rubik's Cubes are in the same camp. Hard for people, but easy work for computers. And then there's Sudoku. Computers can usually solve a normal 9 by 9 grid in a few milliseconds, even though humans find them challenging. But as you make the grid bigger, the problem just gets really hard, rapidly getting out of reach for even the most powerful computers. 2. P stands for polynomial time. In P, the number of steps you have to do to solve a problem, and therefore the amount of time that it takes, is some polynomial function of its size. Polynomial is a mishmash of Greek and Latin meaning many names, which is, regrettably, a pretty typical example of math's flair for unhelpful terminology. Anyway, polynomials are functions involving n or n squared or n to other powers, like these. But importantly, they're not exponential functions, like 2 to the power of n, which gets to be a ton of steps really fast as n goes up, a lot quicker than n to the power of 2. So that's p. It's problems like mazes and multiplication, where the number of steps required isn't that bad compared to the size of the problem. NP is all about polynomial time checking. NP stands for non-deterministic polynomial time, which, being math terminology, is an almost mean-spirited way of saying that if you had a bajillion computers and you could check all possible answers at the same time, you could find a correct solution in polynomial time. 2.5. We're actually talking about the number of steps required to solve a problem in the worst-case scenario. Like, how many steps does it take to unscramble a Rubik's Cube? Well, when it's scrambled like this, it takes 1 step, but it can get a lot worse. Similarly, some 9x9 Sudokus are harder than others. People also look at things like the best case and the average case, but worst case analysis is what we know the most about. 3. Actually, pretty much everybody thinks it's obvious that NP contains more problems than P. It's just that we haven't been able to prove it. The bad news for fast solutions came in the early 70s when complexity researchers realized that dozens of those NP problems they were struggling with were essentially all the same problem, with some easy polynomial time complications thrown in here and there. These are called NP-complete problems, and since that first batch in the 70s, we've added Sudoku and protein folding and problems underlying puzzles and games like Battleship, Free Cell, Mastermind, Tetris, Minesweeper, and making up crossword puzzles. Even classic video games like Super Mario Bros. And Metroid turn out to be connected to NP-complete level traversal problems. NP-complete is yet another math phrase, meaning that these problems include all the really hard parts of every NP problem. A fast program for solving any NP-complete problem could be used to solve every problem in NP. The whole class would instantly collapse. So yeah, amazingly, Sudoku is hard because it involves literally the same NP-complete task that makes protein folding hard. If you come up with a profoundly faster way to play Sudoku, let somebody know, okay? Because fast protein folding would help us cure cancer. But the fact that a bunch of smart people have all been unsuccessful coming up with fast programs to solve what turned out to be essentially the same problem looks like a pretty good clue that the fast programs just aren't out there. So why has it been so hard to prove P versus NP one way or the other? Well, fun fact, proving things is an NP problem. The P versus NP question itself is one of these problems. So yeah, this might be difficult. Or not. We don't know. As the field of computational complexity has developed, we've discovered a lot of complexity. The P versus NP question turns out to be just the main attraction in a huge and complicated zoo of complexity classes. Beyond NP, there are even harder classes of problems, like EXP, the class of problems including figuring out the best move in chess that takes exponential time to even check. This whole upper area of problems that are at least as hard as NP-complete is called NP-hard. There's also co-NP, the class of problems where instead of being easy to check right answers, it's easy to exclude wrong answers, which may or may not be the same as NP. And then there's P-space, the class of problems that can be solved given unlimited time, but using only a polynomial amount of space for memory. There are also problems that can be solved probabilistically in polynomial time. That class is called BPP, and it may or may not actually be the same as P. And then there's a quantum computing analog of BPP called BQP. All over the place in here are complicated little classes that would take a lot of explaining. And actually, some of these turn out to be infinite hierarchies of problems that are slightly more difficult from the ones beneath them. We know there's an exponential hierarchy, and there's probably a polynomial hierarchy. And out beyond all of this are problems that are just not solvable by any computer in any amount of time or space. To me, the amazing thing about this whole complexity zoo is that we're talking literally about what can be computed in a given amount of space and time. We're not just looking at the nature of computation here, we're looking at the nature of space and time themselves. This mess of computational complexity classes, I think, ultimately has implications for physics and biology and for our basic understanding of everything. As an example of those implications, here's how Scott Aronson, a complexity researcher at MIT, explained his intuition about P versus NP. If P were equal to NP, then the world would be a profoundly different place than we usually assume it to be. There would be no special value in creative leaps, no fundamental gap between solving a problem and recognizing the solution once it's found. Everyone who could appreciate a symphony would be Mozart. Everyone who could follow a step-by-step argument would be Gauss. The world around us, the nature of living things and ideas, of art and genius, is molded around the deep structure of computation. In a very real way, something connected to P versus NP shows up in the struggles of scientists and artists. Chopin once said, "Simplicity is the final achievement." After one has played a vast quantity of notes and more notes, it is simplicity that emerges as the crowning reward of art. And Jack Kerouac put it like this: One day I will find the right words, and they will be simple.
So I don't expect everybody to get all of that, but I'm just trying to plant the seeds for, this is, where we're going with this stuff. And you're going to see it come up later on when we try and put everything all together. I think that this view of information as being the fundamental thing, and the algorithms that go with it is going to be what underlies everything. And that's what we'll see, in my opinion, Jung called the collective unconscious underlying everything. And it's, so that's the thing that bubbles everywhere, and so it goes. So let's now go off to some slideware here. We're going to go back to here we are with Jung, and we're going to just do a little bit of biography on Jung, and then we're going to go off and do some of the ideas that he came up with, but I found some nice YouTube videos to complement this, so we'll try and squeeze those in as well.
He's wearing a fez in that picture, which is his Gnostic side.
Right.
Showing.
So let's see, why doesn't this thing, there's no way to get, well, here we go. The material comes out of Wikipedia, but in the concepts that we're dealing with, we covered these last year. We're going to cover them in a different way this year, but there was the notion in psychiatry of a complex of extroversion and introversion. I think Jung, in fact, invented these terms, extroverts and introverts. Then we have archetypes, archetypal images, and mythology here. This was a key area that he viewed as for understanding things. And then we had what he modeled the psyche as having a persona, a shadow, an ego, and then this collective unconscious that was there with an anima or an animus, and then this self-individuation. This is what we're here in life, and we all as individuals self-individuate. We're constantly striving toward doing this. And then Jung himself was very spiritual. And so he actually, as we saw, he actually funded a lot of the publications of the Nag Hammadi scrolls that were found after World War II. And there are two key things here, this Liber Novus, or the Red Book, and the Ion, or the researches into the phenomenology of the self. And we actually have both those. We have the Red Book sitting behind us, and we have the Ion is paperback. And if you recall from last time, the Red Book was, Jung actually did it before 1920, but it wasn't published until what, 2005, something like that. There's a lot of things that Jung wrote and that still haven't been published that are out there. He's incredibly prolific. So here's the people. Oh wait, we're on share screen, so you got to get off share screen. Hold on. Here we go. Here's Red Book here, and this has like these are all pictures that Jung did, and this is his script. More pictures. And this thing is huge.
Beautiful.
And yeah, and this is Ion, okay, which is mucho smaller. But these are incredible treatises that the ideas, the density of the ideas in these things is just unbelievable. So now we'll go back to our chart here.
They're really about, you could say, the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius.
That's why I put in that Jung was born in the 19th century. He lived up to 1961 in the 20th century, but it's really in the 21st century that I think it'll become clear what his real impact is. It's just starting to sink in for people. So what we have here is he was born 1875, died in 1961, and he had his career was as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. Okay, he had his own school of analytical psychology, but he had impact not just in psychiatry, but anthropology, archaeology, literature, philosophy, and religious studies. Okay. And that's only because they haven't published everything that he's written. I'm sure it'll go beyond that. And he actually worked all the time in various clinical settings. And so he was very much, on the one hand, down to earth, and on the other hand, incredibly conceptual. The ability to frame a good question is really, in my opinion, the hallmark of who you are in terms of your intellect. And Jung was able to pose questions that other people never even thought of. And then once he posed the question, then it was clear how to go answer it, so people were over too. They didn't know what the question was, and they didn't know how to answer it. Jung just did these things all the time. He just kept throwing these things off. Jung did, because of his clinical work, Jung attracted the attention of Sigmund Freud, who had his original school of psychoanalysis, and they had all kinds of correspondence and collaboration and so forth. But at the end of the day, Freud wanted Jung to be his successor, and Jung said that my views are taking me in a different direction. I don't think you're going down the right path. And so they split there, and it was a very painful split, but it was what happened. Okay. So then that takes us to this. I wish I could figure out how to get this thing to go. Nope, it won't go. So the key thing, the concept that Jung developed in his analytical psychology is this notion of individuation, which is the lifelong process of differentiating of the self out of each individual's conscious and unconscious elements. So Jung considered this to be the main task of human development, and he created some of the best known concepts, including synchronicity, archetypal phenomena, the collective unconscious, the psychological complex, and this notion of extroversion and introversion. By the way, Jung, we showed you some pictures out of his Red Book. He's an outstanding artist, but he was also a great craftsman. He built a lot of stuff with his own hands, and so it goes. So one of the things that ended up as an example of something that he built with his hands was he had a pencil case, and at the end of it there was a wooden ruler. Okay, so he actually carved a tiny mannequin into this thing, and he would periodically go back into his pencil case and look at it and bring little messages that were inscribed in his own secret language. As a kid, he had his own secret language, and this gave him inner peace and security. So that was the tip-off that he's not your normal kid. So years later, okay, he ended up discovering that his activities were quite similar to indigenous cultures, in that they collected soul stones, for example, near this town of Arlesheim, or the Chunrungas of Australia. Okay, so and then they had ceremonial acts with this. He had his intuitive ceremonial acts. They had very, complicated ceremonial acts that went along with this. And so somehow he was linking into their symbols, into their archetypes, and this collective unconsciousness just at this early age, when he was growing up. Now let's see, I missed something here. Here it is. So when he was 12, and he was going to a gymnasium in Basel, Switzerland, he was pushed to the ground by another boy so hard that he lost consciousness. And he recognized later that this incident was indirectly his fault. But a thought came to him, which was, you don't have to go to school anymore if you faint, okay? So whenever he started walking to school or began to work on his homework, he fainted, okay? And so this went on for a while. And then what happened was he was home for 6 months, and then he heard his father speaking to a visitor about his son's future ability to support himself. And his father suspected that he had epilepsy. And when he was confronted with the reality of his family's poverty, Jung realized that he really had to excel academically so that he could support himself. And so he went into his father's study and he began poring over Latin grammar. He fainted 3 more times, but eventually overcame the urge and didn't faint again. And after this event, he recalled, that's when I learned what a neurosis really is. He had induced his own neurosis doing this. So he decided to support himself. He'd become a preacher or a minister. And there was a very strong moral sense in his household, and a lot of his family members were clergymen. And so for a time, he went off in this direction. But his family couldn't afford to send him any further than the University of Basel, which didn't really have things like archaeology, okay? Which is what he decided. He finally wanted to study archaeology rather than becoming a preacher. So after studying philosophy, Jung decided against the path of religious traditionalism, and he instead decided to go study psychiatry and medicine. He was intrigued with what Freud, for example, had come up with. It was a really novel new way of looking at the human psyche and all of the things that went with it. And so he jumped into it wholeheartedly. So the thing was that this combined both biological and spiritual activities. So in 1895, he began to study medicine now at the University of Basel. And unfortunately, his father died within a year, and the family was almost completely destitute. And some relatives passed the hat and were able to allow Jung to complete his studies. And he had a paternal grandfather that was the illegitimate son of Goethe, and his German great-grandmother, Sophie Ziegler. Okay, and then this is to give him some notoriety and make him stand out from the other kids at the University of Basel. But then after a while, he said, actually, Sophie was just a friend of a niece of Goethe's. And for those of you that don't know, Goethe would be comparable to Isaac Newton in terms of, intellect and everything else. He was off the charts, as you name it, he did it. So that takes us up to the year 1900. He was born in 1875, so he's 25 years old. He moved to Zurich, and then he started working at this hospital. And he ended up doing his doctoral dissertation there. And the title of the doctoral dissertation was on the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomena. and it was based on the analysis of the mediumship of Jung's cousin, Helene Preiswerk, under the influence of Freud's contemporary Theodor Horney. So this really grabbed Freud's attention. Look at the title of his doctoral dissertation, and this is an amazing guy. So so let me go here. So he went to Paris and studied there for a bit, and then came up with his idea of a complex with in the psychological terms, and he became a permanent senior doctor at the hospital, and also became a lecturer Privatdozent at Zurich University, and then started publishing papers and went into private practice. Eventually, Freud and Jung got together, and there was a huge amount of correspondence. They worked together, cooperated for 6 years. In 1910, Freud proposed to Jung that he, as his adopted eldest son, his crown prince and successor, to be the president, to the position of lifetime. So it's a lifetime election to the president of the newly formed International Psychoanalytic Association. However, after a lot of objections from Freud's colleagues in Vienna, it was agreed that Jung would be elected to serve just a 2-year term. And when he didn't even finish that, he ended up publishing The Psychology of the Unconscious in 1912, which made manifest the great differences between what Jung was working on and what Freud was working on. And that was when he disengaged from doing this. So let's take a look at these ideas there. The first thing is the notion of the unconscious. So Jung saw Freud's theory of the unconscious as incomplete and unnecessarily negative and inelastic. Okay, it wasn't flexible enough. It didn't allow for growth. According to Jung, Freud conceived the unconscious solely as a repository of repressed emotions and desires. And Jung's observations overlap to the extent with Freud's model of the unconscious and what Jung called the personal unconscious. But his hypothesis is more about a process than a static model. That is, Jung is always focusing on the process, the evolution, whereas Freud has been focusing much more on just these static concepts. And he proposed the existence of a second or overarching form of the unconscious beyond the personal one, which he named the psychoid, which is a term he borrowed from somebody else. But the collective unconscious is not so much a geographical location, but a deduction for the alleged ubiquity of archetypes over space and time. So we have these notion of these archetypes that are manifest in the heroes that Joseph Campbell talked about. These archetypes are all through space and time. We see them, for example, in astrology, when they're associated with these different planets, when you're dealing with trying to do various things in astrology. And Jung was an astrologer. He taught himself astrology. And then you have them collectively working together on everybody. So we have this notion of this, again, collective unconscious. So therefore, the personal and professional relationship between Freud and Jung was just gone. And after the break in 1913, Jung went through a very difficult and pivotal psychological transformation, which was exacerbated by the First World War. And Jung's experience here was what was called a creative illness. Wouldn't people say he had a nervous breakdown?
Yes.
A creative illness and a nervous breakdown are the same thing.
But he kept functioning.
Right. He was still having patients. He was still having clients and so forth.
And working at the clinic and teaching classes and so on.
Right. And he had what went with this was he was taking all of these ideas and putting them into what he called black books. And all of the black books are like 7, 8, 9 black books. And he started doing these paintings. They became what we had just now, which is the Red Book. But that wasn't published until what, 2000 or something. It was
around 2010, I think.
Yeah, 2010. So you can see. At the age of 38, Jung had this confrontation with the unconscious. So he saw visions and he heard voices. He worried at times. He was menaced by a psychosis or was doing schizophrenia. He decided it was a valuable experience. And in private, he induced hallucinations, or in his words, a process of active imagination. He recorded everything he experienced in small journals known as the Black Books, although the 7 volumes do have brown covers. Well, Jung then began to transcribe his notes into a large red leather-bound book on which he worked intermittently for 16 years. And he's doing all of this other work at the same time, so it's hard to appreciate how much energy he had. So here's our picture of the Red Book here. And he left no instructions posthumously about what to do with this thing, what he called the Liber Novus, or the Red Book. And this one historian tried for 3 years to persuade Jung's heirs to have it published, but it wasn't until mid-September 2008 that fewer than 24 people had even seen it. And finally, his grandson decided to have it published when the necessary funds were raised, which didn't take any time whatsoever. So that's why we even have this today. And then the actual
and you have read this book?
To read this book is like having your head expanded. It's like having a lobotomy. You start to realize how smart Jung really is. In fact,
yeah. So totally wild revelations, or
yeah. Hold on. Let me just. This is a good place to go do that. Let me just go to the screen share thing. Wait. Let me do one other thing. You get out of this. I just have to switch, and I'm going to go to. But
no, we have not read it cover to cover.
I don't know that anyone really has and survived it. I'm just going to show you this little short video, and you'll get some idea. This is someone who made a career out of just following Jung and writing about Jung, Jordan Peterson, and he has his own set of YouTube videos. This is just one of them. There's I don't know, 50 of these things he's done, and it's just totally mind-boggling. So hold on one sec. We're just going to get there with this.
It created a minor revolution in the Jungian community when it was published. There was tremendous resistance to doing it in the first place.
Yeah.
And
I find Jordan Peterson a fascinating personality. Really brilliant observations, whether I agree with them all or not.
I don't know how important it is, but it might be really important.
Right.
This is something that Carl Jung said, so it depends on how important Jung is. Jung was a tremendously insightful clinician, and he was a strange person, introverted visionary, high in introversion, very, 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 very high in openness, like off the charts. And also, God only knows what his IQ was. I mean, every time I read Jung, it's like reading Nietzsche. It's terrifying because, he's so damn smart that he can think up answers to questions that you don't even It's not like you don't understand the answers. It's that you never conceptualized the damn questions. He's one of these visionaries who can see way underneath the social structures and look at patterns that are developing across, in Jung's case, across thousands of years, and lays them out. And so he wrote these books, notebooks that haven't been published yet, called the Black Books. And the Black Books are the documentation of his experiments with his imagination. And what he would do is daydream, like a child daydreams. He had figures of imagination that came to him that he could speak with. And he spoke with these figures of imagination and documented that over a very long period of time. And that was eventually distilled into a book called The Red Book, which was published about 3 or 4 years ago. And it was a book that Jung regarded as the central source from which all his inspiration emerged. It was sort of, the way it looks to me is that we embody a lot of information in our action, right? And our action has developed as a consequence of imitating other people. And not only the people around us, but of course the people around us imitated the people who came before them, and those people imitated the people who came before them, and so on, so far back that it's as far back as you can go. And so you embody these patterns of behavior that are extremely informative, that you don't understand, that are a consequence of collective imitation across the centuries. And so then those patterns can become manifest as figures of the imagination. And those figures of imagination are the distillations of patterns of behavior. And so as the distillations of patterns of behavior, they have content, and it's not you, that content. You could even think about it as content that's evolved, although it's culturally transmitted. It's content that's evolved. And so these figures of the imagination can reveal the structure of reality to you. And that's what happened with Jung. And that's what he described in the Red Book. And that was what permeated his psychology, a psychology that was based on the presupposition that the fundamental archetypal structures of religious belief were not pathological, not deceitful, not protective in some delusional sense against the fear of death, but quite the contrary. The very stories that enabled us to move forward as confident human beings in the face of chaos itself. And it's conceivable, I think, perhaps probable, that nothing more important conceptually happened in the 20th century than that.
So there you have one. Since we're here, we have a Jung page now for ours. I'm just going to go down to this other chap.
I'd just like to chime in
Go ahead.
that one of the key differences between Jung and Freud was that Freud saw just about everything that he was looking at in people as pathological. It was very much a medical model, whereas Jung was more like an anthropologist, and he was seeing it as expressions of culture that they may be strange, but they were perfectly normal and healthy if you didn't judge them and reject them. And that's really what he learned from his own journey with this active imagination. I mean, it wasn't psychosis. It was too organized, and he was conscious. He wasn't on drugs or, in a trance state or anything. He was sometimes in an altered state. You could even see that in the art and the handwriting. It's just so regular. You couldn't possibly write that in a normal state, but it wasn't abnormal. And I think that was one of the biggest differences between their two schools of thought. He was really trying to share with us like the sub-rasa of normal psychology.
I think also he felt Freud's emphasis on the dreams was just too limiting. There was much more to what was going on to actually help people to deal with their issues than just focusing on these dreams.
And Freud's focus on dreams was that it was all about wish fulfillment.
Yeah, so for me, the distinction that I always found between the two, in my mind, I always found Freud to be dealing with a single plane, whereas Jung was dealing with multiple planes.
That's a nice way of putting
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, the archetypes are multifaceted that he's dealing with, but plus the collective unconscious. So
And in the way that guy, the other, what was his name? Who was the first guy that we saw his video? He was showing that they,
Jordan Peterson.
yeah, that they have a life of their own, the archetypes.
Yeah, they evolve and people evolve. And Freud was much more static in the models and framework that he was dealing with. Jung just didn't buy into that. So go ahead.
I would posit that perhaps you could say that Freud viewed things in a unicultural manner, whereas Jung viewed it in an acultural or multicultural manner.
Yeah,
Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's good. Yeah.
sure. I'm just want to do one more video so you'll get a different slant on this stuff. I'm going to do this video by Terence McKenna, so you'll get.
I wasn't kidding about what an honor I think it is to address the Jung Society. At one point in my life, my greatest desire was to become a Jungian
Let's
analyst.
just introduce
And
him.
I
He
had the
is
good fortune of
he
coming
runs
upon.
Hold on.
a school in California that's very devoted to consciousness. It's a very contemporary view of modern consciousness. I'm blanking on the name of it, but he's written a lot of books, and it's a very interesting institute out in, I think it's in Berkeley. Am I right?
He could be from there. There's a bunch of places. I was just focusing on. He is going to talk a little bit. Let's let him run through his video, and you'll see what he's talking about here.
On Jung very young. I was about 15 when a very precocious friend of mine brought Psychology and Alchemy in the Carrie F. Baines translation. I think it had just been brought out. And we were stunned, and we read it from cover to cover, and then went on to Mysterium Conjunctionis, Ion, the studies in the phenomenology of the self. I said to someone yesterday, we read all the books of Jung that the Jungians never read. They seem to stop up there toward the front of the line with the archetypes of the collective unconscious and the personality type. But to my mind, it was the late stuff that was fascinating. And I am slightly puzzled, and we were talking about it last night, at the distance between the Jungian community and the psychedelic community, because they seem to me, the unschooled observer, to be definitely sharing the same concerns. And strangely enough, they share much of the same history and geography. Basel was, of course, Jung's hometown. It was Albert Hoffman's hometown. Did one half of town know what the other half was doing? I'm not sure. The relationship of Jung to the unconscious, to the collective unconscious as its discoverer, has been always somewhat puzzling to me, because of course, if you know the history of 20th century art, you know that Dada, which was the great prefigurative movement for surrealism, rose in Zurich. So, we've got LSD, the schools of modern art that laid great stress on the irrational, and the great schools of psychology that extended the boundaries of the unconscious, all rattling around in these little Swiss towns. And it's interesting to imagine conversations or meetings that might have taken place when people slightly left their ordinary habits and wandered into bars they didn't know and drank with people they'd never met before. Because Jung provided maps of the unconscious, and at 16, when we were beginning to experiment with this, and let me stress, this was before the great social waves of LSD taking of the 1960s. Just preceding that, from about 1963 to 65, we were frantic for maps of the unconscious, and Freud was useless. I mean, the notion that the contents of the psychedelic experience could be reduced to what Freud called day residues and repressed sexual desire, stuff like, didn't wash. Within 10 minutes, you could tell that was not a serviceable metaphor. Jung, on the other hand, offered a vast pantheon of gods and archetypes and psychic complexes forgotten or abandoned. I mean, I thought of Jung basically as what I call a noetic archaeologist, someone who goes with toothbrush and nutpick to dig away the detritus from the bones of vanished idea systems. And if any of you have ever read the works of Jung in the Bollingen set, you know that the richness of it is all in the footnotes. I mean, here was a man who raised the footnote to a high art and who was aware of a literature that nobody else, to my mind, seemed to know about. That Jung's references reach 1,000 years deep into the past with great density of reference. I mean, this is where I learned about Macrobius and Dositheus and Dionysius, the pseudo-Areopagus, and all those folks that you just never hear about. It was my introduction to the underbelly of Western civilization was through Jung. Well, to my mind, and now I'll theme this in to today's theme. I think Maria mentioned that Jung did not have a lot to say about shamanism. He came to it late in his life, and he had already worked through the exegesis of the symbol systems of the European mind. And so he was sort of content to indicate shamanism as an area where more work was to be done. And then the great follow-on scholar was Merciliade, who then actually studied shamanism, showed what its archetypal underpinnings were in all times and places. And the combination of Jung and Iliade, I think, pretty much delivered us as firm a map of the psyche, as dependable a map of the psychic geography as we can expect to have until we make the trip ourselves and readjust the landscape with our own notes and observations. For Jung, the great path into the unconscious was alchemy. And alchemy is an interesting pivotal domain, because I think we could, in a way, say it lies halfway between the concerns of an archaic shamanism and halfway between the concerns of a quasi-scientific psychedelic attempt to explore consciousness. Merciliade wrote a brilliant book on alchemy called The Forge and the Crucible, which is the bridge to show you how you go from Jungian psychology into an understanding of alchemy that approximates Iliade. The notion for the alchemists that Jung brought forth very strongly was the idea of projection of psychic contents, projection of the active imagination onto processes and objects in the exterior world. In the case of the alchemists, it was the swirling chemical processes in their alembics, in their alchemical vessels, that they projected the great round of the archetypes on to these chemical processes. They saw crystallization, sublimation, separation as statements about the contents of the psyche, as much as statements about the exterior world, because for them, the firm division between mind and matter, the firm ontological division between mind and matter that is built into Western thinking now, did not exist. That comes with René Descartes, with the invention of what's called the res extensa, the extended world, and the res virens, the interior world, which has no spatial extension. So for the alchemists, mind and matter were two terms whose mutual exclusivity could be blurred under certain circumstances, and the terms of one could migrate toward the other. Well, now we as moderns ordinarily only experience this state when we are intoxicated by hallucinogenic drugs, or when we are in a state of severe psychic weakness, when there is then overwhelmment from the unconscious that is not with the permission of the ego, as happens in the psychedelic experience. Well, all of these various ways of approaching the psyche seem fairly abstract and bloodless and removed from daily existence, unless the psychedelic experience is present. And then it vivifies these metaphors. It makes clear what these various perennial traditions are talking about.
So while we were doing this, I looked up on Wikipedia about Terence McKenna, and he passed on in the year 2000. He was an American ethnobotanist and a mystic who advocated for the responsible use of naturally occurring psychedelic plants. And he wrote a lot about psychedelic drugs, plant-based entheogens, shamanism, metaphysics, alchemy, language, philosophy, culture, technology, environmentalism, and the theoretical origins of human consciousness. He was called the Timothy Leary of the 90s and one of the leading authorities on the ontological foundations of shamanism and so forth. He actually went to Berkeley and then went off on his own. He had if you read this thing, it's truly amazing. He went off to Jerusalem and then off to Nepal. And then he went up to the headwaters of the Amazon, where he discovered these psilocybin mushrooms, which he started growing like crazy. And he apparently took cannabis every day since he was age 16. So
Is this the video, Bart? I'm sorry, that we just saw. You're speaking about the presenter, the last video.
yeah, that's who he is.
Oh, cool.
And he's there's some interesting.
Do they talk about his institute there?
Yeah, well, he wrote a book on. It's called the Psilocybin Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide. That's one. But the other one that he wrote was about his trip up the Amazon. He called it The Invisible Landscape: Mind, Hallucinogens, and the I Ching. Okay, so he claimed to see in the I Ching, after taking all these various hallucinogenic substances, he came up with a theory that said that there was going to be an incredible transition sometime around 2012, which unfortunately didn't live to see, and so forth. So, he's a very high-powered intellect person who, we're lucky enough to have YouTube to have a video of him. But this is going to go back to the lecture now, unless anyone's got any other comments. So that this gives you some idea of the impact that someone like Jung had, and that everything was in this red book, and really the rest of his life was spent in trying to just break out pieces of it, and that became Jung's lifelong career.
It was like all his data came from the Red Book,
Yeah,
and then he was working out the theories for the rest of his life.
and remember, he started this when he was 38, and he spent 16 years on this. So, there's a huge amount of work in this thing. When you see all the stuff that he wrote, you just wonder if he ever slept. It was just incredible. His thought was formed by these early family influences. On his mother's side, there was an interest in the occult and solid academic theology. And on his father's side, there were two important figures. His grandfather, who was a physician and academic scientist, and the connection with the niece of Goethe, which is no small thing. So here he was as a practicing clinician and writer, and he founded this school of analytical psychology, and much of his life's work was spent exploring related areas such as physics, vitalism, Eastern and Western philosophy, alchemy, astrology, sociology, and literature and the arts. Okay, so he was interested in all these things. But he really preferred to be seen as someone who was a scientist. So we have here these notions of archetype that is the basis for his analytical psychology. So this is, you would say, borrowed from anthropology to denote this universal and recurring mental image or theme. It's his definitions of archetypes varied over time and have been subject to debate as to their usefulness. Then we have the archetypal images, which are these symbols that can mediate opposites in the psyche, and often are found in religious art, mythology, fairy tales, so forth. Jung would often, like the I Ching, he was always thinking of two extremes. So he's looking at an axis with two poles to it, and then I'll lay on top of it another axis with two poles to it. Always looking for these extreme things to try and get insight by building these sorts of structures into what's going on. And then he had the notion of a complex, which was a repressed organization of these images and experiences that really governs the perception and behaviors. So that's where he was heading with his psychology. We have the notion of,
But again, a complex was dynamic. It wasn't a thing.
yeah, you
It
have
was a-
to.
It was a process.
You have to remember, none of these things are fixed. There's always an evolution. They're dynamic. So go ahead.
You do us a favor, and you're on the right of the screen. It's an area that says properties. If you close it, it'll make the main screen larger and easier to read.
Sure, there we go. No problem. Thank you. The key one is to get into slideshow, but I can't do that. So the notion of an extrovert and introvert, again, Jung apparently was the first to come up with this idea. But some people are very open, some people are very reserved. What does this lead to? The notion of persona, or the element of the personality that arises for reasons of adaptation or personal convenience, or the masks that one puts on in various situations. So the persona, you could think of this as the Greek theater, the Greek chorus. People are putting on this mask and that mask to do these things. And then the notion of the shadow, the repressed or therefore unknown aspects of the personality, including those considered to be negative. So these are all the real beef here in what he used as tools to carry out his clinical work and to get people to build on this, to set up his school. We had the notion of ego, the center of the field of consciousness, the psyche, where the part of the psyche where a conscious sense of identity and existence resides. But then we have the collective unconscious, which is the aspects of unconsciousness experienced by all people in different cultures, which he felt was common, and this influenced all of us. We have the notion of anima and animus. So the feminine, the anima, is the contrasexual aspect of the man's psyche. His interpersonal feminine conceived both as a complex and an archetypal image. So you have this image that goes with this complex here, whereas the animus, the masculine side, is the contrasexual aspect of a woman's psyche. Her interpersonal masculine conceived both as a complex and archetypal image. And then we have the notion of self, the overarching concept of the individuation process as symbolized by mandalas, the union of male and female, the totality, the unity, and this Jung viewed as the psyche's central archetype, the notion of self. And the individuation was the process of the fulfillment, which negates neither the conscious or unconscious position, but does justice to them both. And then finally, we have this notion of synchronicity, which is he viewed as an acausal principle. I'm not sure with this notion of these compactified dimensions that there isn't some notion of causality there for the apparently random simultaneous occurrence of phenomena. And this is what he spent all his time with Wolfgang Pauli. Why don't we just take a break and go back to, there's a couple of other videos here. So let's.
Can I ask a question, Bart?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, it's regarding synchronicity. Seems to be a phenomenon that I don't really feel like that's a psychological issue. It's more a phenomenological issue. I'm unclear how it would relate to the individual psyche.
I think it was just put in there because it was something that he worked on and published on. Okay, but I would agree with you that it looks like it comes in out of left field. What does it have to do with?
Well,
with
again, because he was talking about the normal psyche. It wasn't a neurotic thing. It's a phenomenon, but it requires a psyche. It doesn't just mean events happening at the same time. It's not just coincidences. There has to be an experience of meaning, which is internal. There's a subject. So that's the psychological dimension in the normal sense. In terms of normal psychology, it's the individual experiencing the synchronicity. There has to be that feeling of meaning and resonance for it to truly be synchronicity and not just things happening at the same time.
Well, I would just share my perspective on that, which is that unless the one has a philosophical perspective on the universe, that the whole universe revolves around oneself, and that everything in our experience is really a fabrication of our own psyche, unless you prescribe to that, I am inclined to think that synchronicity is an external phenomena, the causation of which I would be clueless about, but it doesn't, I can't see how it is tied to an individual psyche, you know, in the way that Jung or mainstream psychology would view an individual psyche.
Well, I could think it would just be each individual occurrence of it is not the phenomenon itself, but the experience of it occurs in the psyche of an individual. It's, in that sense, it's not objective.
I viewed it as this collective unconscious is with all of us. Each of us has this piece of collective unconscious, and that leads to this capability for synchronicity, for having linkages between different individuals through this collective unconsciousness to create these events that occur. So the examples that were cited were how Wolfgang Pauli would walk into a laboratory and to see some experiment, and that they had specially put together for him, and the whole experimental apparatus would collapse. And he did this enough times that people couldn't believe it. And they viewed it as, that's what led to this thought of synchronicity. And how in the world does Pauli do this? What in the world is going on here?
They called it the Pauli effect.
So
Jung said that we tend to experience more synchronicities when we're in the field of an archetype, when a particular archetype is active in our lives. That kind of speeds up the synchronicities. So it's connected to that.
yeah, we're going to come back to this. So I'm going to just go into this one. We have this one video here, just going into these archetypes in more
revealed by the
detail.
arrangements they produce in consciousness,
Hold on one sec.
namely
I have
through
to
the
go.
manifestation of symbolic imagery.
Hold
It
on.
is only through the interpretation of the symbols manifested by the archetypes that one can gain an
It started at the
understanding of
beginning.
stimuli and input from the world to obtain structure and form, or does it have a preformed structure which influences how we experience the world? This question has long interested psychologists and philosophers alike. Carl Jung, the 20th century psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, believed the latter to be the case. There exist, according to Jung, identical psychic structures common to all, which are heritable and influence the way all humans experience the world. Jung called these structures archetypes, and in this video we will provide a detailed introduction to archetypes, explaining what they are, how they influence our lives, their relationship to symbols, and Jung's ideas on the connection between religious experiences and the archetypes. Carl Jung, in addition to being a practicing psychiatrist, was one of the foremost experts on the study of religious and mythological symbology. It was work in both these fields that led him to the discovery of the archetypes. In studying the myths and religions of cultures past and present, Jung noticed that many of them shared similar patterns, themes, and symbols. This was interesting in its own right, but what further piqued Jung's curiosity was that some of these same themes and symbols arose in the dreams and fantasies of patients who suffered from schizophrenia. What could account for such similarities? Jung proposed that the human mind, or psyche, is not exclusively the product of personal experience, but rather contains elements which are pre-personal or transpersonal and common to all. These elements he called the archetypes, and he proposed that it is their influence on human thought and behavior that gives rise to the similarities between the various myths and religions. To properly understand the role of the archetypes, we must first explain Jung's conception of the psyche. Jung described the psyche as one's total personality, encompassing all one's thoughts, behaviors, feelings, and emotions. Jung divided the psyche into three major realms: consciousness, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. These three realms are not closed off from one another, but constantly interact in a compensatory manner. The conscious realm is simply one's field of awareness, consisting of those psychic contents that one has knowledge of. In other words, any experience that enters one's field of awareness takes on the quality of consciousness. The conscious realm of the psyche, while extremely important in its own right, is, according to Jung, dwarfed in scope by the unconscious realm. The unconscious consists of those psychic contents which one is unaware of, and Jung divided it into two main parts, the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious, as the name suggests, is particular to each individual. It consists of events of one's life that are deemed insignificant, are forgotten, or are repressed due to their distressing nature. In addition to the personal unconscious, there is a deeper and more fundamental realm of the unconscious, which Jung called the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious consists of psychic structures or cognitive categories, which are not unique to the individual, but rather shared by all, influencing our thoughts, behaviors, and the way we look at the world. In other words, the collective unconscious is home to the archetypes. As Jung put it, from the unconscious there emanate determining influences, which, independently of tradition, guarantee in every single individual a similarity and even a sameness of experience, and also of the way it is represented imaginatively. Jung's student, Erich Neumann, used the analogy of physical organs to help illuminate the concept of the archetypes. Just as a body is structured by organs which are largely formed prior to birth, so the mind possesses psychic organs which structure it, i.e. the archetypes. Furthermore, just as the physical organs in most cases operate without one's conscious awareness, so do the archetypes. And most importantly, just as adequately functioning physical organs are essential for a healthy body, a healthy mind is reliant on the proper functioning of the archetypes. As Neumann explains, the archetypal structural elements of the psyche are psychic organs, upon whose functioning the well-being of the individual depends, and whose injury has disastrous consequences. An important difference between the physical organs and the archetypes is that while physical organs can be directly observed with the senses, the archetypes cannot. The existence of archetypes is revealed by the arrangements they produce in consciousness, namely through the manifestation of symbolic imagery. It is only through the interpretation of the symbols manifested by the archetypes that one can gain an understanding of the archetypal pattern of the human mind. Edward Edinger, in his work Ego and Archetype, provides an explanation of what a symbol is with respect to Jungian psychology by contrasting it to a sign. A sign is a token of meaning that stands for a known entity. By this definition, language is a system of signs, not symbols. A symbol, on the other hand, is an image or representation which points to something essentially unknown, a mystery. A sign communicates abstract objective meaning, whereas a symbol conveys living subjective meaning. While signs, by this definition, point to definite things which exist in the world, symbols do not stand for things which exist in the physical world, but rather point to the existence of unknown elements of the psyche or patterns of the unconscious. As Jung put it, whenever we speak of symbolic contents, we move in a world of images that point to something ineffable. We do not know how clear or unclear these images, metaphors, and concepts are in respect of their transcendental object. However, there is no doubt that there is something behind these images that transcends consciousness and operates in such a way that the statements do not vary limitlessly and chaotically, but clearly all relate to a few basic principles or archetypes. It is important to point out that the archetypes do not manifest the exact same set of symbolic images for each person. Rather, the archetypes provide the structure, not the specific form of the symbolic image. The specific form the images take differ from culture to culture and even individually. However, as Jung stated in the passage just quoted, the symbolic manifestation of the archetypes do not vary limitlessly and chaotically. Therefore, as one takes note of and reflects on the symbols as they are manifested in consciousness, knowledge of the archetypal structure of the mind can be obtained. Erich Neumann describes the role of the symbol in producing knowledge of the archetypes in the following way. The form of representation peculiar to the unconscious is not that of the conscious mind. It neither attempts nor is able to seize hold of and define its objects in a series of discursive explanations and reduce them to clarity by logical analysis. The way of the unconscious is different. Symbols gather round the thing to be explained, understood, interpreted. The act of becoming conscious consists in the concentric groupings of symbols around the object, all circumscribing and describing the unknown from many sides. Each symbol lays bare another essential side of the object to be grasped, points to another facet of meaning. Only the canon of these symbols congregating about the center in question, the coherent symbol group, can lead to an understanding of what the symbols point to and of what they are trying to express. To provide an example of the types of symbols which are manifested by the archetypes, we will look at the archetype Jung called the self. The self is the central archetype, and its role is in unifying the other archetypal structures of the psyche. According to Jung, the importance of the self archetype coincides with the fact that it is the source of many of the symbols found in religions and myths. Edward Edinger in Ego and Archetype reveals the wide array of symbols manifested by the self. The self is expressed by certain typical symbolic images called mandalas. All images that emphasize a circle with a center and usually with the additional feature of a square, cross, or some other representation of quaternity fall into this category. There are also a number of other associated themes and images that refer to the self, such themes as wholeness, totality, the union of opposites, the central generative point, the world navel, the axis of the universe, the elixir of life. All refer to the self, the central source of life energy, the fountain of our being, which is most simply described as God. Indeed, the richest sources of the phenomenological study of the self are in the innumerable representations that man has made of the deity. What is interesting to realize is that Jung believed the various representations of deities in myths and religions, both past and present, were at root symbolic manifestations of the self archetype. However, Jung did not in any way mean this as a reduction of God to a product of man's mind. Rather, as he wrote, this is certainly not to say that what we call the unconscious is identical with God or is set up in his place. It is simply the medium from which religious experience seems to flow. As to what the further cause of such experience may be, the answer to this question lies beyond the range of human knowledge. Knowledge of God is a transcendental problem. Throughout Jung's life, he struggled with the question as to what the ultimate source of the archetypes was. At times, he suggested they arose in an evolutionary manner and were subject to change over long periods of time. The following passage reflects this view. Man possesses many things which he has never acquired, but has inherited from his ancestors. He is not born as a tabula rasa, he is merely born unconscious. But he brings with him systems that are organized and ready to function in a specifically human way, and these he owes to millions of years of human development. However, Jung also had sympathy with the idea that the archetypes may be similar to the Platonic forms, existing as a type of immutable transcendental entity. As Jung wrote at one point, whether this psychic structure and its elements, the archetypes, ever originated at all, is a metaphysical question and therefore unanswerable. Whatever their ultimate source, Jung believed that the archetypes play an immense role in the lives of all individuals. By becoming increasingly aware of the archetypal patterns through the symbols they manifest in the psyche, the individual experiences an expansion of consciousness. Such an expansion, Jung believed, was of paramount importance, for as he put it, man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. Neither should he persist in his unconsciousness, nor remain identical with the unconscious elements of his being, thus evading his destiny, which is to create more and more consciousness. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being.
Wow.
So I'm just going to try one more here, which is the one up here, since we touched on this, which is
And did you believe in God?
Oh, yes.
Do you now believe in God?
Now, difficult to answer. I know. I don't need to believe. I know.
When Carl Jung made this claim, there was a lot of obvious controversy over what he meant, such as what does he mean by I know exactly? Had he seen God? Was his views on God core to other specific religious worldviews like Christianity? What did he mean? Well, after all of this, he wrote a letter to at least attempt to explain what he meant by this phrase in the interview. In this particular video, I won't paraphrase or rephrase what he said. I will just read it out as he wrote it, as it is not very difficult to internalize and understand. He does write some parts in Latin, but I will just translate it to English. As I quote, "Sir, so many letters I have received have emphasized my statement about knowing of God. In Face to Face, the listener, October 29th. My opinion about knowledge of God is an unconventional way of thinking, and I quite understand if it should be suggested that I am no Christian. Yet I think of myself as a Christian since I am entirely based upon Christian concepts. I only try to escape their internal contradictions by introducing a more modest attitude, which takes into consideration the immense darkness of the human mind. The Christian idea proves its vitality by continuous evolution, just like Buddhism. Our time certainly demands some new thought in this respect, as we cannot continue to think in an antique or medieval way when we enter the sphere of religious experience. I did not say in the broadcast, there is a God. I said, I do not need to believe in God. I know, which does not mean I do know a certain God, but rather I do know that I am obviously confronted with a factor unknown in itself, which I call God in the consent of all, that it is always or is everywhere. I remember him, I evoke him. Whenever I use his name overcome by anger or by fear, whenever I involuntarily say, oh God, what happens when I meet somebody or something stronger than myself? It is an apt name given to all overpowering emotions in my own cyclical system, subduing my conscious will and usurping control over myself. This is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life for better or worse. In accordance with tradition, I call the power of fate in this positive as well as negative aspect, and inasmuch as its origin is beyond my control. God, a personal God, since my fate means very much myself, particularly when it approaches me in the form of conscience as a vox Dei, with which I can even converse and argue. We do and at the same time, we know that we do. One is subject as well as object. Yet I should consider it an intellectual immorality to indulge in the belief that my view of God is the universal, metaphysical being of the confessions or philosophies. I do neither commit the impertinence of a hypostasis, nor of an arrogant qualification such as God can only be good. Only my experience can be good or evil, but I know that the superior will is based upon a foundation which transcends human imagination. Since I know of my collisions with a superior will in my own psychic system, I know of God, and if I should venture the illegitimate hypostasis of my image, I would say of a God beyond good and evil, just as much dwelling in myself and everywhere else. God is a circle whose center is everywhere, whose circumference is nowhere. With that said, I will probably do another video on this for comparing Carl Jung's view on God with Jordan Peterson's view on God, because they are very similar, which is no surprise because he was heavily influenced by it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment your thoughts down below, and subscribe for more content on philosophy and psychology.
Okay, so there you have some little snippets to give you some, different perspectives on the activities of Jung. We're pretty much at 9 o'clock, so I'm going to just hold off. We've gone through maybe half of the material that we were going to cover, and we still have some other videos to cover too. So I just had a question for Bruce. So you notice this notion of collective unconscious, and this Jung was talking about we're here to achieve in this individuation and link up with whatever archetypes are there with us and so forth. To me, this sounds like, in some sense, a view of enlightenment, of trying to achieve something. You're constantly striving for it. Have you thought at all about this? What Jung was doing with a Buddhist view?
Well, one of the problems I have in general is the lack of union. Like when you start seeing the deeper levels of the mind, all reality is in union. Like there's a kind of a intuitive depth understanding of that reality. And a lot of the things that I'm hearing are more connected with the self, and the self makes you think that everything is kind of like subject object everywhere. But in terms of my experiences, it's not that at all. It's all about union. So it's kind of like I'm kind of like kind of missing it a bit. I'm not really understanding it.
I think he didn't reach the conclusion. He talked about this collective unconsciousness and how it's there, but he never realized, what if you reached out to it? What if you're able to join up with it? What would happen to self, or to the unconscious self that he was talking about?
Well, there's also two different things. There's the lowercase self, which is the ego, and then there's the capital S self, which is what he's talking about there, which is more about the unified self, the transcendent self, or you could say God. So he is, it's not clear, but when it's the capital S self in those quotes, he's not talking about your conscious ego self. He's talking about something transcendent.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, in terms of the kind of experience I'm used to, is that when you have unfoldment of the mind, a lot of these, what I would call appearances, simply actually disappear. And another reality is actually what's been existing there all the time. So it's a kind of a different fluid looking at the mind than when is a self. When there's a self, there's an individualization of everything. You think that's how it is. But in terms of experiencing some of the deeper levels of the mind, it's not true at all. There's union and love mind, and it's like vast and extremely intelligent. It is beyond any kind of normal understanding whatsoever. And that's normal. If you think of everything as being separated and all that, that's not normal. So,
Right.
So I kind of like struggling with trying to figure out Jung in terms of my own experience.
He's a product of Western Europe, the Swiss, and yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, my takeaway just listening to this last video was that it just struck me that Jung seemed to create two camps. One being the, for lack of a better word, the local, the self that we all think of as self, and that which is greater than, which he is lumping into God, that he's saying is not necessarily like a Christian God or the God as generally described, but that, in the vastness out there beyond the self is lumped in as God. That was my interpretation of what I heard.
I'm wondering if Barbara has anything to say as a psychologist among us.
I only wish I was anywhere near as intelligent as Jung. I think that you hit it right on the head, Marge, when you were talking about the small s and the large s. Our self is individuated, and that's what we're striving for as individuals. But I don't think it's that simple, and I don't think Jung is saying it's quite that simple. It also incorporates all the other things that are known to us, but are underneath our conscious mind, those subconscious things that we only get glimpse of, but really make us richer and fuller and connect us and unionize us, so to speak. I'm reminded of a experiment that one of my friends did, and when faced with an array of shapes and things that could suggest a face, universally, all cultures that were tested gravitated towards the images that would suggest a face of a human baby. Now, how do we all, across all of human existence as we know it, regardless of geographical or theological or experiential thinking, gravitate towards the image of a round face that would suggest to us an infant who needs to be taking care of the thing that we need to collectively take care of, so to speak. It can't be just simply a matter of survival, although that has a part of it. There has to be something. So what I'm suggesting is, I think that your suggestion, the small s and the large s, is one of the best summaries that I've heard so far. Yes, we are self. Yes, our goal is to individuate and fully understand who we are as individuals and experience as the best we can what that means to each one of us. But each one of us is also part of the collective, and part of the collective, the vast majority of that came before we were incorporated into this thing we call our self, our human image. He's difficult to understand, but I think that I think that's really good, Margie.
Well, thank you. I really like the way you just expanded on it. I think that was helpful. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I would just add that he would say the process of individuation is incorporating more of the transcendent capital S self into our conscious personality self.
Absolutely. And in a sense, in a way that I've always understood them, in a sense that individuation sounds like might sound to us as a standalone, but we are so much more than that. And incorporating those things that we don't have direct experience with,
right?
Comes to the sense of what Bruce calls union in a way. Yeah.
Bruce wanted to say something.
I kind of forgot what I was going to say. No, it's gone. Sorry.
Sorry, Bruce. I'm sorry.
Well,
No. Come back another time.
I was thinking that this self, what Bruce has been saying is that the loss of self. It's non-duality, that you're actually linking up with this collective unconscious, which is all around us, and then you have this incredible realization of of reality, of what's really going on all around you, that you miss by having this self in the way, either small s or large s. And that's just something that I guess Jung, in all the things he did, he apparently just didn't focus on this, or he didn't.
Or maybe I was thinking, maybe, you know, his Jung, from what I understand, studied, you know, the Eastern, like Buddhism, and he took a lot of interest in Eastern religions, but maybe it was more academic. He didn't have the experiential base because he didn't maybe have a guru like Bruce has had for decades of work, and Jung maybe just never got to that experiential of he was more doing the academic to just, he was fascinated and delve into it, but just didn't have enough time, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, that's what actually, you helped me remember what I was thinking. I mean, I can very well understand him coming to those kinds of an understanding if he's helping other people with problems. Like there's a lot of patterns and different kinds of mental phenomena out there. And when somebody is trying to make a real effort to try and help, well, then he's in his mind, he's coming up with all these explanations. And that sort of like fits in how I can understand him thinking that way. But in terms of really looking on the inner and what happens when you say meditate a lot or something like that, or have a guru, that was, I haven't talked about that much, but that was really spectacular stuff. There's a whole different perspective altogether. You know, it's just like totally different, not just a little, but a whole lot. So,
Yeah.
like that.
I just have this simple image in my mind, and it may or may not be worthwhile to share, but we all have probably heard of the image of dropping a pebble in a pond, or a chickpea in a bowl, and that there's just that there's a center, but then there's these ripples out. To me, that kind of signifies the big S, that, you know, our individualization may be that small pinpoint, but as we're not just that, we're echoes of all those things that came before us.
You know, there's a lot of efforts spent on trying to articulate what's happening. And that is very different from finding it when you look inside. It's really different.
Yes.
One of the biggest ones is you find this vast understanding of love and compassion. Like, it's just mind-boggling. And people just normally don't see that because, well, they don't meditate, you know, or whatever I did, which was, well, my main experience is with the guru, of course. That's a whole different dialogue. But it's like there's a huge difference between having realization deep in your own mind and trying to figure out what somebody else was talking about.
Right. That's 100% true, Bruce. Yeah.
It's like a different world altogether.
Well, maybe, I don't know if they have, I've found some, but I think it might serve us well to look at more of the images from the Red Book that he produced during those 16 years. And you will see that there was a practice there. There was an experiential dimension that was going beyond his conscious personality. You know, and yes, it was differentiated. You know, it wasn't this one unity,
Mm.
because he was working, I would say, on a more Western path with, different cultural memes, themes and images. But there was definitely a process of transcendence and growth and learning that was taking him beyond his personal experience, his conscious personal experience.
Mhm.
And he was incorporating more and more of his unconscious and the collective unconscious into his conscious mind through those kinds of like journeys, which I think Terence McKenna kind of touched on in talking about the people who were, doing these shamanic experiments and working with these substances that were giving them, these altered states. That it's not just thinking.
Right.
It's
So-
not just the realm of ideas, although that was a part of it.
So in the Eastern and Buddhist thinking, did they ever work with any of the psychedelic plants or altered states using plants?
No, I mean poppies,
No,
I mean,
definitely not. It's considered a distraction.
Okay.
And
So-
there's
so-
also, there's a fundamental precepts you take. Not to kill, not to steal, incorrect speech. But one of them is not to take anything that fogs the mind. The real fundamental principle in Buddhism is development of awareness in your own mind. And that's all where it comes to. Because you get to a level of awareness where you actually perceive directly what's really there. It's not you can kind of get beyond conceptions entirely. So it's a different understanding. And there's a deeper understanding of the mind that everyone has. They're all accessible by everyone, but getting there is not so easy.
So Bruce, do you still have that capacity to get into that oneness space that you have said is so wonderful, or is that something you're not doing right now without a guru or without that particular? I don't know what your level of practice is today.
Well, the biggest thing that I was able to do is the self disappeared. I had, prior to it, I had a lot of insights into the nature of the self. And in terms of the realization, the self simply disappeared entirely, and all the mechanisms and all the different things that are around it simply vanished. And that's, to be Buddhist about it, that's kind of what they call the realization, the emptiness, and so on. But it's basically a discovery of a level of your own mind that's been there forever. That's actually what it's like. Like all of us have a huge, long history for thousands and thousands of lifetimes. And there's an incredible depth of wisdom that everyone has, and everyone can find it. But if you have a self, the self is your reality, and you can't get there.
So can you go in between? I mean, I'm assuming that you go in this between being connected to the self and being not connected to the self.
No,
Can
the self.
you transcend those things, or do you transcend those things?
Well, it's not transcending. What you actually realize, which is kind of strange,
Okay.
is you found out that it had never existed in the first place. it's that kind of thing. Very different, but like it was an illusion, a distraction, an appearance all along. And the real mind was in a deeper place, which is much more my experience of love mind, heart mind, and incredible compassion. There's many levels of reality in the mind that have that. But the real one is that's what was there all along. And the self, which you developed over, from family conditioning and, things from previous lives and all that sort of thing, was never reality in the first place. And the mind simply knows it's that reality on its own. So it has, experiences of incredible clarity and certainty, because the mind recognizes itself. So it's more of that sort of thing. So when I have that kind of understanding, you listen to all these concepts going around, and I'm trying to fit them together and all that, but it's actually not like that at all. It's nothing to do with the intellect at all. It's kind of a heart thing.
That was good. Thank you. Thank you.
Bud wanted to say something.
Well, I have a question in the same vein. I just try to gain some kind of emotional understanding of how this love mind reality lives concurrently with the person that you see when you look in the mirror, that I'm looking at an image of, that the government requests you pay taxes, to, how does that individual reside concurrently with the love mind?
But very interesting question. Basically, believe it or not, in reality, they're not actually separate. What happens is that there's a much deeper part of your mind that understands reality. Everyone has that. And so, in a sense, it knows what the reality really is. So it, in a sense, it goes along with the idea of having a self, because it couldn't stop it, because it was, a lot of the formations of the mind are quite traumatic, like being killed in a previous lifetime and all kinds of really horrific stuff. So there are formations in the mind that have a momentum that have been there for quite a while, or maybe not all that long. And so the deeper mind is always trying to get to a deeper part. Everyone has that. Everyone is like a mystical or living in the mysteries already. They just all have their own individual one. Everyone knows there's more. It's obvious there's more. I mean, the mind can tell you right away there's more to this than it appears. And so in fact, the deeper mind is extremely intelligent about it, and it never loses reality. So it's in a sense, in Buddhism, what you do is you're trying to connect with that level of your own mind. And it just is very good at that. So in a sense, even though you think you have a self and you're kind of having problems this way and that way and the other, it's actually not true. The deeper mind already knows what real is reality already. And everyone is searching for that. It's kind of like, in my own perception, when you look at a person's mind, everything is that reality. So it's sort of like the universe is unfolding in everyone differently, but not separately, which is interesting.
I'm just sensitive about the time. Any last question?
Well, we didn't hear from Bud all night.
Bud, you had a question?
I just want to see if I can't tie it all together. I think Gurdjieff really had the language for it. in every partnership, there's always been this conflict. There's always been division. You know, Gurdjieff and Uspensky, Freud and Jung, and the Cheryl really, I think Cheryl really had the question that really nailed it. You know, talking about the intellectual as opposed to doing it. And Taoism, I think, really expresses that, you know, and Jesus talks in Christianity, Jesus talks, you know, what is the greatest commandment? Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, with all thy strength. And that's where the fourth way comes from. And to Gurdjieff, it was esoteric Christianity. There's a great paper that I have that talks about the fourth way, where Uspensky was more intellectual, emotional, and Gurdjieff was more physical. But to tie that together, since we all have all of those things within us, we really can't talk about any one of them separately. But all of those are what brings us to the spiritual, and, you know, God is love. I love you all. Thanks for being.
Okay.
Pretty good.
Yeah. Let's
A
close
good
it
note to
on
close
that
on.
note. Thank you, Bud. We'll see
Thank you.
everyone next week.
And I
Maybe
love
they'll-
all the videos you put up. That's phenomenal.
Well, go to the website, you'll see.
Yeah, I'm gonna check it out. It's really cool. Nice job.
Oh, thank you too.
Work. A lot of work.
Thank the internet. Don't thank me.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
you
curator.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
The internet is the new commons.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night, night.
Good night.